Good evening. Like many in Canada who joined the Canadian Armed Forces, I started my career immediately out of high school by volunteering for the infantry in the Royal Canadian Regiment. My time in uniform didn't last long, just short of 5 years. I had been injured while serving as a peacekeeper in Bosnia and left the military shortly after having some surgery to fix things up. After that, I decided to build off my experience that I'd already gained, and I went on to work in first government and after private security spheres. The time that came after that took me across the majority of the world. I was conducting threat, risk, and vulnerability assessments, and I was also writing the safeguarding plans after those for the purposes of better protecting people or better protecting systems. All that to say that otherwise, my professional career has spent most of the time focusing on the darker sides of humanity, the dark things that humans do to each other, the what, the why, the where, the when, and the how to, again, better protect people, or in the terms of my teaching, to better prepare others to prevent dangers or to respond effectively if those dangers occur. A little while later, for the past 5 years now, I've been running my own nonprofit. It's the first New Allied Expeditionary Force, and we deliver humanitarian aid as well as stability development services in conflict zones. So it's through that particular lens, the lens of helping people and the lens of trying to better preserve the good in humanity, that I'm here to speak with you this evening. And as mentioned, it's about things that aren't often spoken of. They're fairly dark, but yet they need to be spoken of. So I tend to deal with the specific far better than the general. So let's look at a very specific set of circumstances here right now. It's late June 2014, and a band of ideological militants are growing in strength. They're committing attacks across Iraq and Syria. On one particularly horrific day in Tikrit, those fanatics murdered 770 individuals in one go. The scale of those attacks were so huge that they could be seen from satellite. The victims here were savagely murdered either by being shot in the head and having their bodies dumped in the Tigris River, or being lined up on the ground while their bodies were riddled with bullets by the fighters. They grew in success after this. They had many successes in this space, and things only got worse a couple months after what we've seen here. The newly named Caliphate of the Islamic State and fighters thereof decided to set their sights on the indigenous Yezidi Kurdish population as their next target. In August of 2014, those fighters committed genocide against the Yezidi people living on Sinjar mountain. Thousands dead, thousands raped, thousands kidnapped, thousands tortured. All this happened on the news while the world watched on, and nobody took steps to stop the slaughter. Very horrible things to consider, truly, the wide-scale rape, murder, torture, and slavery of human beings, people just like you and I. I know that this is a lot to take in right now, some of the images that you've seen, some of the things that I've said, but it is here in this very specific context of atrocity now that the topic for my evening begins. So we must fast forward from those events to now, 4 years ahead, almost 5 years ahead. Picture this. A 12-year-old Yezidi boy is living in a displaced persons camp. He's just short of 100 kilometers away from his home. He's been there for 2 years. He was reunited with his mother and his sister, who had been there for 4. The 2 years prior, he was a caliphate cub. During the raid of his village, he was kidnapped. Before being kidnapped, he was forced to witness the murders of all his male family members and the rape of his mother. Once in captivity, he was deeply abused, physically, sexually. He was also formed to undergo militia training, weapons, tactics, hand-to-hand combat. He was 8 years old. Now, he was then forced to use that training against other members from his community that had been held in captivity as well. But this particular boy feels lucky because the other boys like him were forced to kill members of their own family. Trust me, these are boys. Their innocence was ripped away from them. Zaid. Zaid was a young man that my team met during a 2016 assessment in northern Iraq. We were there under the leadership of Yahi Hamza, our country director, to view the humanitarian response to the genocide. And during that time, we met Zaid and a number of other boys like him, and we learned of the deep suffering that they were facing, and we also learned of the conditions that they were facing now in the camps. Zaid, and all the boys like Zaid, were indoctrinated to be ideological warriors, loyal to the Islamic State above all else, including family. And that brings us here now. We call these boys the lost boys of the 21st century. They're lost. You might be wondering why it is that we call them lost when they've been rescued. Well, the truth is that none of these boys have access to care or services beyond the basic necessities of life. And moreover, they're being excluded from the care and services that they need to treat their wounds because of their gender. The clinics that we approached that we knew my organization had helped simply stated that the programs weren't for them because they have been designed and implemented to serve as women victims. So what does this mean? This means that we have some boundaries to cross together. Firstly, we need to recognize what happens if we don't help these boys. They have faced the worst torture and abuse imaginable. They have been trained and conditioned to commit acts of violence. They've been indoctrinated to hate. If it's not clear what the consequences of failing to help these boy victims are, I'll tell you right now. In 5, 10 years max, we'll be fighting them as they become the violent perpetrators of the next generation. The next point we need to take on is we need to recognize the flaw in our global narrative surrounding victims. And for this, I'll highlight personal experience. And most often when I'm speaking and engaging others on this topic, within the first few seconds, there's an injection. Somebody makes a statistical reference. Yeah, but X% more here, or X% more there, with some kind of a gender spin on it. When this happens, I'm always reminded of this one particular point, and that is, to a victim of violence, they do not care about any statistical references or differences in relation to another victim. All they know is that they are a victim and they need help. This point is very important for all of us because it's each and every one of our own responsibilities, how we speak about and how we think about victims. Because we need to hold our nations and the bodies our nations support responsible to ensure that they do not impart gender bias, either directly or indirectly, as they implement humanitarian aid and development programs. Lastly, most importantly, we need to act now. We are years behind helping these boys already. I can't tell you exactly how. It's existing all over the world. Crucially, I'm not even the only person to have identified this. In 2013, the United Nations held a workshop assessing violence and sexual violence in conflict. The purpose of that workshop and the attendees were tasked to identify any correlations that they may be able to find in where violence is taking place and peace programs are failing. The findings of that report were very interesting, to say the least. They placed acts of violence and sexual violence against men and boys at the forefront of their findings. It was so much so that the special representative of the UN overseeing these measures called the scenario a crisis. She wanted to make two very definitive statements about boy victims. First, that they are victims that suffer in silence. Next, that they too suffer the health complications, the physical injuries, the psychological stresses and traumas, and the sexually transmitted diseases that come from these sort of attacks. That was 2013. That was before the events of the Islamic State. That was before the worst humanitarian crisis in human history struck our world and utterly crippled our response systems. Did anything change after that 2013 recognition? Not at all. Based on my observations, I haven't seen any change. In fact, I've seen it get worse. To highlight that, this year's Nobel Peace Prize was granted to two individuals for their amazing work on raising the voices of victims of violence and sexual violence and conflict. One of the recipients is from the Yezidi community that I've spoken of. She's a female victim of the Islamic State. The other recipient is a male doctor from the Congo who has delivered treatments to women and girl victims for decades. During the presentation and acceptance speeches for this year's Nobel Peace Prize, boy victims weren't mentioned once. The focus was very squarely on women and girls. It is time to act. It's time for all of us to act. Again, as I said, the only thing I can tell you is what I'm doing in hopes to influence others to do more as well. So in 2016, my team conceptualized the Lost Boys concept that brought me here today. And we've been working with a few of the boys since then, based on our own services. Our long-term intent and goal is to create a center where we can bring these boys in and give them the treatments that they need. Because again, they have suffered the worst that is imaginable. The indoctrination was so horrible, and the abuse that they faced was just wild. We want to be able to take this center, and we want to be able to deliver them the clinical and medical care that they need, the psychological care that they need, the de-radicalization that they need. We want to be able to deliver them education and knowledge building so that they learn more about the world around them. We want to be able to deliver them into community volunteer services. We want to be able to help them reintegrate into their communities in a positive manner. And lastly, we want to make sure that they're engaged with global peers and have them talking to them and learning from them all the way along. Our requirements to be successful in this are fairly simple, in theory. We need people and nations and the bodies that those nations support to first recognize the challenge, and second, change the narrative on victims. Lastly, we need them to act. But we can't do it alone. Not at all. And in that, this is my call to you. Friends and colleagues of the audience, mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, daughters, sons, to you, help me. Help me end the cycles of violence. Help me prevent future generations of all genders from falling victim. And stand with me to help the boys, the lost boys of this world. Thank you.